form follows function is a principle associated with modernist architecture and industrial design in the 20th century. The principle is that the shape of a building or object should be primarily based upon its intended function or purpose. Origins of the phrase. The American architect Louis Sullivan coined the phrase, although the authorship of the phrase is often wrongly ascribed to the American sculptor Horatio Greenough, whose thinking to a large extent predates the later functionalist approach to architecture. Greenough's writings were for a long time largely forgotten, and were rediscovered only in the 1930s. In 1947 a selection of his essays was published under the title Form and Function. Remarks on Art by Horatio Greenough. The American architect Louis Sullivan, Greenough's much younger compatriot, who admired rationalist thinkers like Greenough, Thoreau, Emerson, Whitman and Melville, coined the phrase in his article The Tall Office Building Artistically Considered in 1896, though Sullivan later attributed the core idea to Marcus Vitruvius Pollio, the Roman architect, engineer and author who first asserted in his book De Architectura that of structure must exhibit the three qualities of firmitas, utilitas, venestas, that is, it must be solid, useful, beautiful. Here Sullivan actually said form ever follows function, but the simpler phrase is the one usually remembered. For Sullivan this was distilled wisdom, an aesthetic credo, the single rule that shall permit of no exception. The full quote is thus: Sullivan developed the shape of the tall steel skyscraper in late 19th century Chicago at the very moment when technology, taste and economic forces converged and made it necessary to drop the established styles of the past. If the shape of the building was not going to be chosen out of the old pattern book, something had to determine form, and according to Sullivan it was going to be the purpose of the building. It was form follows function as opposed to form follows precedent. Sullivan's assistant Frank Lloyd Wright adopted and professed the same principle in slightly different form, perhaps because shaking off the old styles gave them more freedom and latitude. Debate on the functionality of ornamentation. In 1908 the Austrian architect Adolf Loos wrote an allegorical essay titled Ornament and Crime in reaction to the excessive invented ornament used by the Vienna Secession architects. Modernists adopted Loos's moralistic argument as well as Sullivan's maxim form follows function. Loos had worked as a carpenter in the USA. He celebrated efficient plumbing and industrial artifacts like corn silos and steel water towers as examples of functional design application in different fields. Architecture. Louis Sullivan's phrase, form follows function, became a battle cry of modernist architects after the 1930s. The credo was taken to imply that decorative elements, which architects call ornament, were superfluous in modern buildings. However, Sullivan himself neither thought nor designed along such dogmatic lines during the peak of his career. Indeed, while his buildings could be spare and crisp in the principal masses, he often punctuated the plain surfaces with eruptions of lush Art Nouveau and something like Celtic Revival decorations, usually cast in iron or terracotta, and ranging from organic forms like vines and ivy, to more geometric designs and interlace, inspired by his Irish design heritage. Probably the most famous example is the writhing green ironwork that covers the entrance canopies of the Carson, Peary, Scott and Company building on South State Street in Chicago. These ornaments, often executed by the talented younger draftsmen in Sullivan's employ, would eventually become Sullivan's trademark to students of architecture. They are his instantly recognizable signature. product design. One episode in the history of the inherent conflict between functional design and the demands of the marketplace happened in 1935, after the introduction of the streamlined Chrysler Airflow, when the American auto industry temporarily halted attempts to introduce optimal aerodynamic forms into mass manufacture. Some car makers thought that aerodynamic efficiency would result in a single optimal autobody shape, a teardrop shape, which would not be good for unit sales. GM thereafter adopted two different positions on streamlining, one meant for its internal engineering community, the other meant for its customers. Like the annual model year change, so-called aerodynamic styling is often meaningless in terms of technical performance. Subsequently, drag coefficient has become both a marketing tool and a means of improving the saleability of a car by reducing its fuel consumption slightly and increasing its top speed markedly. The American industrial designers of the 1930s and 40s like Raymond Loewy, Norman Bell Geddes and Henry Dreyfuss grappled with the inherent contradictions of form follows function as they redesigned blenders and locomotives and duplicating machines for mass-market consumption. Loewy formulated his Mayer principle to express that product designs are bounded by functional constraints of math and materials and logic, but their acceptance is constrained by social expectations. By honestly applying form follows function, industrial designers had the potential to put their clients out of business. Some simple single-purpose objects like screwdrivers and pencils and teapots might be reducible to a single optimal form, precluding product differentiation. Some objects made too durable would prevent sales of replacements. From the standpoint of functionality, some products are simply unnecessary. Victor Papanek was an influential recent designer and design philosopher who taught and wrote as a proponent of form follows function software engineering. It has been argued that the structure and internal quality attributes of a working, non-trivial software artifact will represent first and foremost the engineering requirements of its construction, with the influence of process being marginal, if any. This does not mean that process is irrelevant, but that process is compatible with an artifact's requirements lead to roughly similar results. The principle can also be applied to enterprise application architectures of modern business where function is the business processes which should be assisted by the enterprise architecture, or form. If the architecture dictates how the business operates, then the business is likely to suffer from inflexibility, unable to adapt to change. So a service-oriented architecture enables an enterprise architect to rearrange the form of the architecture to meet the functional requirements of a business by adopting standards-based communication protocols which enable interoperability. Furthermore, domain-driven design postulates that structure should emerge from constraints of the model domain, while form and function may be more or less explicit and invariant concepts to the many engineering doctrines. Metaprogramming and the functional programming paradigm lend themselves very well to explore, blur and invert the essence of those two concepts. The agile software development movement espouses techniques such as test-driven development, in which the engineer begins with a minimum unit of user-oriented functionality, creates an automated test for such and then implements the functionality and iterates, repeating this process. The resultant argument for this discipline of that the structure or form emerges from actual function and in fact, because done organically, makes the project more adaptable long-term as well as higher quality because of the functional base of automated tests. Automobile designing. If the design of an automobile conforms to its function, for instance the Fiat in multipurpose shape is partly due to the desire to sit 6 people in 2 rows, then its form is said to follow its function. Evolution. According to Lamarck's long discredited theory of evolution, anatomy will be structured according to functions associated with use. For instance, giraffes are taller to reach the leaves of trees. By contrast, in Darwinian evolution, form precedes function. That is to say, in Lamarckian evolution the form is altered by the required function, whereas in Darwinian evolution small variations in form allow some parts of the population to function better, and therefore more successful reproductively.